In the previous video, I told you that contextualization is very important. So how do we write a country case with proper context? Now, this study was about Syrian refugees in Gaziantep, Turkiye, and how they experienced the war and displacement. It isn't about Syrian political history. An entire book could be written from various angles to talk about Syria's political history. That was not my aim, but without a contextualization, you can't locate properly what we are talking about. Particularly, the reader is not going to be understanding. So how I dealt with that in this book was to pay attention the turning points in history, historical moments. In conflict studies, we are very much interested to turning points that people talked about in their narratives. What points in history was important. How I dealt with the context of Syria, where these individuals were coming from and their identities. The history that they are telling is very much based on their communal experiences and historical memories that were formulated within the communities. We always create the identities, historical memories through those identity groups. I will enumerate some of these. I'm going to get into the detail. You can look at the book if you are interested to Syrian history this way, but there are several things I like to tell you in terms of methodological way that could be handled. This is how I handled it. So I collected all of those things that people talked about history, because, as I said, this was not a book about the political history of Syria, but looked into how they explained and located which historical moments in their narratives when they were talking to me. And then I established the historical context based on this, of course. So then I gave a brief chronological review. The historical moments that are prioritized by the people were explained by looking into an extensive literature review of very many rich accounts about Syrian political history. Every time they talked about a historical moment, I read those and I connected their narratives to it if there were mismatches or if they were indeed in the given time frame, and all of those things were checked for accuracy. And then I created this literature review as well for the reader. So there's an extensive literature review about the historical moments in Syria. You can use it as a guide for the very valuable works that has been done. But what I collected in this book starts from French Mandate period, the colonial legacy, which is an interesting thing. Sometimes writings escape that, particularly when you are looking at a contemporary war. Mostly you are talking about, you see mediatic explanations through religious or ethnic cleavages and not very much mention of colonial histories. But when I looked into the people's narratives, when they were talking to me about it, they never forget the colonial history. Interesting, isn't it? That in the memory of people, this is actually not forgotten. So they do always refer, there were a considerable number of people who were referring to French colonial period and the influences of that division of the land for different ethnic groups. And then they talked about from the independence from French to United Arab Republic around the 46 to 58, and then following that with the Ba'ath Party's dominance and that with Assad rule. Assad rule was, of course, talked about the father and the son periods differently, mostly focusing on the influence of father in the creation of the Syria as it was, and then the implications and results that were done for the follow-ups that actually came with the Bashar Assad. Concept of Syrianism was mentioned, so I did look at it in the literature. This is really interesting. Even though there was a Syrianism idea happened historically in Syria, a lot of people were talking about local identities, being an Alopian, from a Damascene, right, from Damascus, and then those localities becoming more important than the Syrian identity, and they became more Syrians when they became refugees in Turkey. This concept is also very familiar. I had students in different countries in Africa, which they always also say the same thing. They actually become talking about themselves from that nationality when they get outside of it due to these are all the effects of colonialist legacies, of course. And the important, not only the historical moments, but they did talk about identities or certain groups that influenced the process of how Syria evolved. One of them is Ikhwan, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood. The other one is Kurdish identity and experiences in Syria, has been mentioned a lot, not just by the Kurdish participants, by the way. I had a considerable number of people who had the opportunity to interact and engage with Kurds of Syria, and then they became aware of their situation as well, and they did openly state that I have never known this. I learned it here when I had this opportunity to be meeting, which is an important thing for us, right? Because within a society, we may have very deep divides and segregations that we may not end up having opportunities in, not every single person or every single community, but a considerable number of people living parallel lives to each other, and some of those participants expressed that as such. And of course, the Hama massacre of 1982 has been a big influence in the memory of Syrians. They talked about it as a point where many of the possibilities of uprisings have been strongly suppressed with the violence that ensued. And then they jumped from there to Dara, which was the beginning of the revolution, as they actually talked about it, the conflict sparking into armed struggle, the incident that ignited the uprising, which was the capture and detention of the youngsters in March 2011. And then, of course, they talked a lot about Islamic State. The importance of the Islamic State was that before that, there were a lot of different groups in Syria, including the minority religious groups that were not very happy with the system, right, with the Assad regime. And then they wanted a change within the system. They wanted openings and everything. But the coming in the Islamic State and the various radicalized Islamic groups ended up being used to challenge that togetherness of people to change the system. And that's why they actually seen that as a big issue. And they also seen a lot of brutality for different groups that changed their idea about the way that this conflict unfolded quite differently than what they were expecting it to be. The contextualization of my look into this is not only about Syria. Of course, I divided it too because they were now living in Turkey. So we did really need to give how the things were in Turkey. And this is also the point when I was doing this at the end of 2015 and beginning of 2016. There already started the boilings against Syrians, like it has done around the world, an anti-refugee mobilization. But before that, there wasn't a lot of this sentiment, right? When they were starting to coming in, there was a lot of solidarity, a lot of help, a lot of empathy going on. All the considerable number of research actually indicates that. But very quickly, Syrians' numbers reach to, in all of Turkey, it's one of, I think it's the largest refugee holding country, if I'm not mistaken. 5.5 million Syrians out there became the 3.2 millions of them in Turkey, of course, right? So it's a considerable number of population. I mean, when you look at the Western countries, even with considerably much larger populations and bigger geographies, right? Even when they're going to take 1,000, 2,000 people, they have a lot of stirring in the community. How are they going to be integrated, and it's not going to be changing the society or culture or whatever. So this 3 million people is a huge number of people that you're talking about. So then this 3 million people being surged into the community has been creating a lot of backlash, right? I think numbers has a lot to do with it, along with the growing global sentiment against refugees that you are seeing everywhere. Of course, you can take isolated cases, what's happening in one country and the other. And when I was doing this, in particularly in Gaziantep, there were, at that point, at the time of the research, there was 400,000 Syrians, which is 20% of the population. It is always an important thing to see the ratio, right? In some places, smaller population cities or rural areas, there were incidents that Syrian population numbers were higher than the local populations. That needs to be carefully designed so that the society would not feel a sudden, immediate change in cultural practices. It's a very important thing. But these were the challenges. I'm giving you the context so then you can see how these things are happening. And at the same time, there was the economic difficulties that Turkey was facing has started to increase at the same time, so that I came to a blaming of refugees, like again, many places you are seeing causes are sort of attributed to the populations. And from positive to negative, we had a very steep increase of negative views. And add to that European countries had Turkey as a buffer zone between the refugees and themselves. This created quite a challenging situation. Created a lot of difficulties and tensions between these two communities. And Syrians, being the refugees, minority, silenced and weaker position, which created a lot of victimizations and difficulties for them. We do really need to look into the power dynamics of different segments of the community, who has more power and less, to understand where we can address the power imbalances that way. In the next video, we are going to look at the theoretical framework, mainly focusing on conflict theories and Azar's protracted social conflict. Please do not forget to subscribe, like, and hit on the bell to see the next videos. See you soon.